May 10, 2026. Emmanuel Macron lands in Nairobi, Kenya. The summit is called Africa Forward, not France-Africa. For 47 years it was France-Africa. Now France has been quietly removed from the name. 15 days earlier, Mali burned. 6 cities under coordinated assault. The defense minister eliminated in his own home. 10,000 insurgents moved as one. And France, the former colonial power that spent 9 years and 5,100 troops on Operation Barkhane, said nothing. No statement, no condemnation, no offer to help. 15 days of silence. The summit location tells the rest. Not Paris, not Dakar, not Abidjan. Nairobi, 2,000 miles from the Sahel, in a region where France never had deep roots. The guest list is even more revealing. East African leaders confirmed. Sahel leaders, 0. Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger. The 3 countries that expelled French ambassadors in 18 months are not there. Were they not invited, or did they decline? The Élysée Palace won't say which. This is not a summit. This is a retreat disguised as a pivot. And the documents reveal exactly when France realized the Sahel was lost for good. The summit has a new name. For 47 years, it was called the France-Africa Summit. Every single one. From 1973 under Pompidou to 2020 under Macron, the name never changed. France-Africa, the host, was always clear. The power dynamic was always clear. Then in 2026, the invitations go out with a different title. Africa Forward Summit. What changed? The rebranding architecture realized something. When your name includes the word France, and half your former partners have expelled your ambassadors, the name becomes a liability. Sources inside the Élysée Palace confirm the rebrand was finalized in March 2026, 6 weeks before the summit date. The timing matters. March was when internal polling showed that 72% of Sahelian youth viewed France as a colonial occupier, not a development partner. The name had to go, but names are easy to change. Geography is harder. For 5 decades, every France-Africa summit took place in Paris or a francophone African capital. Libreville, Bamako, Yaoundé, Abidjan, cities where French was the official language and French influence ran deep. The 2026 summit breaks that pattern completely. The location is Nairobi, Kenya, 2,000 miles east of the Sahel, in a country where France never established deep colonial roots. Why Nairobi? The documents reveal the calculation. Kenya is Anglophone. Kenya has no history of anti-French protests. Kenya's president, William Ruto, needs Western investment and won't ask uncomfortable questions about uranium contracts or military failures. Nairobi is safe. Nairobi is neutral. Nairobi is far enough from Ouagadougou that the optics won't remind anyone of what was lost. But the guest list tells the real story. East African leaders confirmed their attendance by mid-April. Ruto, obviously. Museveni from Uganda. Tshisekedi from the DRC. Then there are the absences. Mali not attending. Burkina Faso not attending. Niger not attending. 3 countries that together represent the collapse of 50 years of French Sahel policy. And none of them are in the room. Were they invited? The Élysée Palace won't say. Diplomatic sources suggest invitations were sent through back channels in early April, but no formal responses were ever recorded. What officials won't say publicly is whether those invitations were designed to be declined. If you invite a government that expelled your ambassador 18 months ago to a summit rebranded to exclude your country's name, are you expecting them to show up? Or are you expecting them to stay home so you can tell other African leaders that you tried? The timing makes it worse. The summit is scheduled for May 10th. 15 days earlier, on April 25th, Mali's transitional government announced it would prosecute French nationals involved in what it called economic crimes during the Barkhane era. That announcement came with arrest warrants for 2 former French mining executives. Macron's office issued a statement calling the warrants illegitimate. Then silence. No diplomatic escalation, no threats. Just 15 days of silence. And then Macron flies to Nairobi. But while Macron prepared his Kenya trip, something else was happening 2,000 miles west. On May 8th, 2 days before the summit, the Alliance of Sahel States held a signing ceremony in Ouagadougou. Phase 2 of the AES integration framework. A regional central bank, a joint airline, shared water infrastructure across the Liptako-Gorma region. Traoré, Goïta, and Tiani signed the accords in front of cameras, while Macron's advance team was setting up in Nairobi. The contrast is deliberate. The rebranding architecture is hosting a summit in East Africa with a new name and a guest list that excludes the Sahel. Meanwhile, the Sahel is building its own architecture with its own bank, its own airline, its own integration timeline. Two visions of Africa's future, playing out on the same weekend, 2,000 miles apart. But the summit name wasn't the only thing that changed. The guest list would reveal something far more damaging. But here's what the press didn't connect. While Emmanuel Macron was in the air on May 10th, flying to Nairobi, the Alliance of Sahel States was signing agreements in Ouagadougou, a sovereign bank. $895 million. No IMF conditions, no French oversight. The same city that expelled France's ambassador 39 months earlier was now building financial infrastructure without asking permission. Two summits happening at the same time. One talking about partnership, one actually building it, and documents suggest France knew about the AS Bank deal before Macron's plane even took off. The guest list wasn't the only thing that changed. The losses were mounting, and they were quantifiable. Start with the military footprint. In 2020, France maintained 5,100 troops across the Sahel, Operation Barkhane. 3 major bases, Gao in Mali, Kidal in northern Mali, Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso. By 2026, that number is 0, not reduced 0. The operation ended August 15, 2022. The bases closed in sequence. Gao evacuated November 2022. Kidal followed December 20th. Ouagadougou shuttered February 2023, after Traoré's government revoked the bilateral defense agreement signed in 1961. What replaced them? Sources inside the Malian Defense Ministry confirm that Russia Africa Corps personnel arrived in Bamako in December 2022, 4 months after the French withdrawal. The documents reveal a phased deployment. First wave, 300 military advisors. Second wave, air defense systems, including Panzer S-1 units photographed at Bamako Airport in March 2023. Third wave, logistics support and training cadres. By mid-2023, Russian personnel were operating from the same facilities France had vacated. The transition took less than 9 months. The diplomatic collapse followed the same trajectory. 3 ambassadors expelled in 18 months. Mali first. September 22, 2022. Ambassador Joël Mayer given 72 hours to leave Bamako after public criticism of the transitional government's timeline. Burkina Faso next. January 16, 2023. Ambassador Lou Haled declared persona non grata following Traoré's televised speech, accusing Paris of harboring destabilization networks. Niger last August 26, 2023. Ambassador Sylvain Ité expelled within 48 hours of the military transition that removed President Bazoum. 3 expulsions, 18 months, 3 different countries. What officials won't say publicly is that each expulsion followed the same pattern. A French Foreign Ministry statement criticizing the transition, a host government response demanding respect for sovereignty, an escalation in state media, then expulsion. The rebranding architecture kept using the same playbook. The Sahel kept responding the same way. But the economic rupture runs deeper. The CFA franc, the currency that has tied 14 African nations to the French treasury since 1945, is now under direct threat. The Alliance of Sahel States announced in March 2026 that Phase 3 of integration includes a feasibility study for a common currency. Not pegged to the euro, not managed by the Banque de France, not requiring French treasury guarantees, a sovereign currency for a sovereign bloc. The study timeline, 18 months, the target launch date, January 2028. The uranium question makes this existential. Niger supplied 35% of France's uranium imports in 2022, making it the #1 supplier for the French nuclear program. Orano, the French state-owned mining company, operated 2 major sites, Arlit and Morerin. After the transition in July 2023, that supply became uncertain. By January 2026, documents suggest that shipments have been reduced by 60%. France is now sourcing from Kazakhstan and Canada at higher cost. The price differential, approximately 12% above previous Niger contracts. French companies are feeling the pressure across sectors. Total Energies faced protests in Ouagadougou in November 2025 after Traoré accused the company of tax avoidance, totaling $170 million over 5 years. Orange Burkina Faso saw its license renewal delayed for 6 months, pending a review of contract terms dating to 2008. Bolloré Africa Logistics lost its port concession in Cotonou, Benin, a critical gateway for Burkina Faso's imports, after the government cited underinvestment in infrastructure upgrades. The message is clear: the old arrangements are over, and while France was losing ground, others were gaining it. China signed a memorandum of understanding with the AS in February 2026 for a regional railway network connecting Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey. Estimated cost: $4.2 billion. Financing: China Development Bank at 2.5% interest over 20 years. The same month, a Chinese state-owned enterprise began feasibility studies for a deepwater port expansion in Benin, which borders Burkina Faso and provides the AS access to the Atlantic. Projected capacity increase: 3 million 20-foot equivalent units annually. Russia's economic footprint expanded in parallel. A gold export agreement signed between Mali and a Russian state-linked firm in April 2025. Value: estimated $800 million annually. A fertilizer supply deal with Burkina Faso in September 2025. Volume: 200,000 metric tons per year. These aren't symbolic gestures, they're structural replacements. The pattern is consistent. French influence contracts. Russian security presence expands. Chinese infrastructure investment accelerates. The rebranding architecture is not competing in this space. It is absent from it. So when Macron arrived in Nairobi on May 10th, the question wasn't whether the summit would succeed. The question was whether it mattered. Because while he was talking about partnership in East Africa, 300 miles west of Nairobi, something was being built that would make the entire summit irrelevant. But the guest list isn't a diplomatic oversight, it's strategic exclusion. 3 countries that expelled French ambassadors: Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger aren't just absent from a summit that still has Africa in its name. They represent the collapse of 50 years of policy, and they're not in the room. Were they invited? The Élysée won't clarify. What officials won't say publicly is whether those invitations were designed to be declined. And the timing of the name change finalized in March, 6 weeks before the summit, tells you exactly when France realized the Sahel was lost for good. Remember the 15-day gap we opened with? Here's what was happening behind it. April 25, 2026, Mali Defense Minister Sadio Kamara eliminated in Bamako. 6 cities under coordinated assault. Janum forces from the north, Flay insurgents from the east. Intelligence reports reviewed indicate between 10,000 and 12,000 fighters mobilized simultaneously, the largest coordinated offensive in Sahel history. France's response? Silence. No condemnation, no intelligence offer, no condolence statement, not on April 26th, not on April 30th, not on May 5th. For 15 consecutive days, the rebranding architecture said nothing about the largest security crisis in Mali since 2012. Why does silence matter? Because for 9 years, Operation Barkhane positioned itself as the guarantor of Sahel stability. 5,100 troops, 48 forward operating bases, annual budget, €1 billion. The entire framework was built on one premise: France is responsible for security in this region. April 25th shattered that premise, and the silence confirmed it. Sources inside the Élysée Palace indicate the decision was deliberate. Not oversight, not diplomatic caution, strategic abandonment. Because acknowledging the crisis would require offering assistance, and offering assistance to a government that expelled your ambassador 9 months earlier. That creates a problem the rebranding architecture cannot solve, so they said nothing. And while they said nothing, the region moved. AS coordinated airstrikes began April 27th. Burkina Faso deployed 2 Su-25 ground attack aircraft to northern Mali. Records indicate 17 sorties flown in 72 hours. Targets: NIM supply routes near Gao. Mali's Air Force contributed 8 missions using Chinese-supplied Wing-Long drones. The coordination was not improvised, it was pre-planned. Intelligence sharing protocols established in February 2026 allowed real-time targeting data to flow between Bamako and Ouagadougou without external intermediaries. The system France spent 9 years trying to position itself as the center of replaced in 72 hours. Traoré's public silence during this period was not hesitation. It was intelligence gathering. Documents suggest Malian military intelligence intercepted communications between insurgent commanders and external coordination cells on April 29. The intercepts revealed logistical support networks operating from across Mali's northern border. Traoré did not speak publicly until May 3. When he did, his statement was 8 sentences. 7 of them were operational updates. 1 was strategic. Mali's security is Mali's responsibility. That sentence was not rhetoric, it was policy. By May 7, Kidal was encircled, the city that symbolized northern Mali's separatist ambitions for a decade. The city France refused to allow Malian forces to enter during Operation Barkhane. Encircled by Malian troops, supported by Burkina Bay air cover, with Russian advisors coordinating logistics. The operation took 11 days from the April 25 crisis to tactical encirclement. 11 days. France spent 9 years saying Kidal was too complex, too sensitive, too dangerous for Malian forces to approach. Traoré's forces surrounded it in less than 2 weeks. Where was France during those 11 days? Preparing a summit in Kenya, May 10th. Macron arrives in Nairobi. The summit agenda: partnership, investment, climate resilience. 23 African heads of state attended. Mali was not invited. Burkina Faso was not invited. Niger was not invited. The 3 EAS member states, representing a combined population of 72 million people and 38% of West Africa's landmass, were excluded from a summit about Africa's future. What officials won't say publicly. The exclusion was not punitive. It was pragmatic. Because inviting Traoré to Nairobi while refusing to acknowledge the Mali crisis would expose the contradiction at the center of the rebranding architecture. You cannot claim partnership while practicing abandonment. You cannot talk about shared security while ignoring the largest insurgent offensive in a decade. The optics would be catastrophic. The summit produced 17 joint declarations: renewable energy cooperation, digital infrastructure investment, agricultural development frameworks. Not one declaration mentioned the Sahel security crisis. Not one statement referenced the April 25 offensive. The largest coordinated insurgent assault in regional history happened 15 days earlier, and the summit designed to reset France-Africa relations did not mention it. That omission was not accidental. It was structural. Because acknowledging the crisis would require explaining why France, after 9 years and €1 billion annually, was no longer responsible for responding to it. It would require admitting that the security architecture France built in the Sahel had collapsed, not because of military failure. Because the governments France was supposed to protect no longer wanted French protection. The timeline makes this clear. April 25th, crisis begins. April 27th. EAS responds without French coordination. May 3rd. Traoré declares Mali's security as Mali's responsibility. May 7th. Kidal encircled. May 10th. Macron lands in Kenya and talks about partnership with countries that still accept French engagement. The message was not subtle. France's silence during the 15-day gap was not diplomatic restraint. It was the sound of a security framework, realizing it no longer had a role to play. And rather than acknowledge that reality in public, the rebranding architecture chose to focus on countries where the illusion of influence could still be maintained. France's silence wasn't just strategic, it was survival. Between April 25th and May 10th, France issued 0 statements on Mali. No condemnation of the attack, no offer of intelligence support, no condolence for the defense minister's elimination. 15 days of silence from the country that spent 9 years and 5,100 troops, claiming it was the guarantor of Sahel security. The silence is the statement. France is no longer responsible. France is no longer relevant. And what Ibrahim Traoré did during those 15 days would prove that France made the right choice by staying quiet. So, why Kenya? The answer isn't complicated. It's calculated. Kenya is not francophone. No colonial baggage. No CFA franc tied to the French treasury. No military bases that became symbols of extraction. No uranium mines. No gold exports flowing to Paris. The rebranding architecture needed a stage where the past couldn't be weaponized against the present. Nairobi offered that stage. Distance matters. Kenya sits 2,000 miles from the Sahel disaster zone, 2,000 miles from Mali, 2,000 miles from the military councils that expelled French forces, 2,000 miles from Kidal, 2,000 miles from the evidence. When you're trying to rebrand failure, geography becomes strategy. And the farther you get from the collapse, the easier it is to pretend it never happened. Then there's the government. President William Ruto's administration remains Western-friendly. Unlike the military councils in Bamako, Niamey, and Ouagadougou, Ruto's government still accepts French engagement, still participates in the frameworks, still uses the language of partnership, still hosts International Monetary Fund delegations without protest. For the rebranding architecture, that cooperation was essential. You can't host a summit about African partnership in a country that just asked you to leave. The message France was sending became clear. We still have friends in Africa, just not where we lost. But the selection of Kenya exposed something deeper. The rebranding architecture operates on three principles: change the name, change the location, curate the guests, remove the word France from the summit title after 47 years of branding, move the event 2,000 miles from the failure zone, invite only the governments that won't ask uncomfortable questions about Kidal, about the 15-day silence, about why French intelligence failed to predict or prevent the AE's response, about why Operation Barkhane collapsed after spending €8 billion over 9 years. What you don't do is invite evidence. And while Macron stood in Nairobi on May 10th talking about partnership and shared prosperity, the AS was building actual infrastructure. The timeline tells the story. On May 8th, 2 days before the Kenya summit opened, the AS finalized Phase 2 of their integration plan. $895 million for a regional development bank headquartered in Bamako, a tri-national airline connecting Bamako, Niamey, and Ouagadougou with twice-daily flights starting in June, 1,000 wells across Niger to address the water crisis that French development aid never solved in 60 years of presence. The contrast wasn't subtle. France was talking about partnership in a country with no French colonial history. The AS was funding infrastructure in the countries France abandoned. Sources inside the summit reported that Macron's keynote avoided any mention of Mali, Burkina Faso, or Niger by name. The prepared remarks focused on climate finance, youth entrepreneurship, and digital innovation, safe topics, abstract topics. Topics that don't require you to explain why 3 of your former colonies just signed a mutual defense pact that explicitly excludes you. Topics that don't require you to explain why Kidal fell without a single French statement of support. The rebranding architecture doesn't acknowledge failure. It redirects attention. But redirecting attention only works if your audience isn't paying attention. And across the continent, people were paying attention. Social media in Francophone Africa lit up during the summit. The hashtag that trended wasn't about partnership. It was about abandonment. Posts compared the $895 million the AS committed to infrastructure with the $0 France committed to post-withdrawal stabilization in the Sahel. Comparisons circulated showing that the AS Bank's capitalization exceeded the total French development aid to the Sahel. In 2023, the optics were devastating, and the rebranding architecture had no response. Documents reviewed after the summit revealed another calculated omission. The guest list included 17 African heads of state, none from the AAs, none from Guinea, where a military transition had also challenged French influence, none from Chad, where anti-French protests had forced base closures. The summit wasn't about African partnership. It was about partnership with the Africans who still said yes. If you're still watching, you already see what mainstream media won't report. The Kenya summit wasn't a diplomatic success. It was a distraction, a carefully staged event designed to create the illusion of influence in a region where actual influence had collapsed. But illusions require belief, and belief requires credibility. And credibility requires that people forget what just happened 2,000 miles away. The problem for the rebranding architecture is that the internet doesn't forget. The AS doesn't forget. The populations watching from Dakar to Kinshasa don't forget, and the timeline doesn't lie. April 25th, crisis begins. April 27th, ACE responds. May 3rd, Traoré declares sovereignty. May 7th, Keitel encircled, May 8th. AS signs. Phase 2. May 10th. Macron talks partnership in Nairobi. The sequence reveals the strategy. When you can't control the narrative in the countries that matter, you create a new narrative in countries that don't. And the question spreading across the continent now isn't whether France can rebuild its influence. It's whether anyone still wants them to. So what does all of this actually mean? 3 things. First, rebranding can't erase documented facts. 5,100 troops withdrawn. 3 ambassadors expelled. A 47-year currency name abandoned. The documents reveal what the press releases won't say. France didn't pivot. France was pushed. And the difference between those 2 narratives is the difference between strategy and survival. Second, silence reveals more than statements. 15 days between the AS announcement and the Élysée response. What officials won't say publicly is that there was no response ready, because the playbook assumed compliance. And compliance ended the moment Traoré signed Phase 2 in Ouagadougou while Macron was mid-flight to Nairobi. The gap wasn't diplomatic caution, it was paralysis. Third, Africa is building without asking permission. The AS didn't wait for approval. They didn't negotiate terms. They announced a bank, an airline, infrastructure wells, and a regional economic zone while France was still drafting talking points about partnership. That's not defiance. That's sovereignty. And sovereignty doesn't require acknowledgement from the powers it's replacing. And that's the pivot, not France's pivot. Africa's. The story we've been told for decades is that African nations need Western frameworks to develop. That independence requires permission. That sovereignty is something granted, not claimed. But what happened between April 25th and May 10th dismantled that narrative in real time. Sources inside the Élysée confirm what the timeline already showed. The Kenya summit wasn't Plan A, it was damage control. An attempt to create the appearance of influence in a region where actual influence had collapsed. But appearances require audiences. And the audience that matters, the populations from Dakar to Kinshasa, stopped watching French press conferences years ago. They're watching Ouagadougou now. They're watching Bamako. They're watching Niamey. Because those are the capitals where decisions are being made without waiting for European approval. So here's what I need you to do. If this video changed how you see France-Africa relations, hit like. Share this with someone who still believes the Western media framing of African sovereignty movements. And here's the community ritual. Drop the pivot, your country, and one thing this video changed about how you see France's role in Africa in the comments. Let's see who's actually paying attention, because the next phase is already happening. The AS Phase 2 infrastructure, build the bank, the airline, the wells. That's not theoretical, that's operational. I broke down the full economic architecture in the video linked on your screen right now. Watch that next if you want to understand what sovereignty actually looks like when it's not asking for permission. This is AfricaPolitic. We don't cover the news, we cover what the news won't. See you in the next one.